The highest casualty rates in the war in Ukraine for both sides are coming out of the eastern town of Bakhmut, where Russian armed forces have now successfully encircled part of the city. It's being called the bloodiest battle of the 21st century, with costly ground assaults and trench warfare over just 36 square miles of territory. But why is it that out of the entire 1,200-kilometer front line, this tiny section is the most dangerous and most important contested area of the entire war? Every day, confusing reports go back and forth saying Bakhmut is about to be surrounded by Russia, and then the very next day, Ukrainian defenders are still standing. In fact, Bakhmut is surrounded by Russian Wagner forces and will fall by tomorrow. I know I said that 3 months ago, but I mean it now. No, it's not. In fact, Ukraine is reinforcing Bakhmut, and it's going to be the location where the spring counteroffensive against Russian forces will happen. You've got it all wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. Let's try to lift this fog of war that is settled over Bakhmut by looking at how we got here, analyzing newly captured Russian military documents that reveal their assault storm tactics being used to gain ground here, and whether or not Bakhmut is really worth the cost of defending at the risk of becoming surrounded. Many sources say the Battle of Bakhmut is largely symbolic rather than strategic, and the town has actually long held symbolic significance when it was renamed to Artemysk in 1924 to honor a Russian communist revolutionary figure, Comrade Artem, who worked in the city at the time. In April 2014, the pro-Russian separatist Donetsk People's Republic captured and held parts of the city, raising a Russian flag there. It took a Ukrainian Special Forces unit alongside National Guard soldiers to expel the DPR. The DPR finally retreated from Bakhmut 3 months later in July 2014, after being kicked out by the Ukrainian military. It was this event that led to May 15, 2015, when former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko signed a bill into law to remove all communist monuments and made it mandatory that settlements with names related to communism be renamed, restoring the original name of Bakhmut and changing the names of over 80 different streets in a symbolic move against Russia. For Putin, the city still holds a symbolic importance. If he's able to capture it, he can point to a victory and even lay down a plausible story of how he could capture the rest of the Donetsk region. On the Ukrainian side, the phrase Bakhmut holds has gone viral and become a kind of rallying cry for Ukrainians, a symbolic phrase to explain their never-give-up attitude in the war, no matter the costs. But the city is more than just symbolically important. It's practically important too, because Bakhmut is a major highway junction. There are two main highways that Ukraine needs to keep open in order to resupply their forces from the western part of the country in order to receive NATO weapons through Poland. The M03 and T0504 highways. There are other names for these highways, but that's what we're going to go with. The T0504 runs east to west all along the southern front line, all the way to Bakhmut, with about 10 to 40 miles of buffer zone between the front lines and the highway. It's no coincidence that the front lines of action were established in cities that are ahead of this highway. Ukraine is able to resupply their forces via this road, and they choose to defend locations that offered a comfortable distance to the front of the highway, keeping it safe. Second is the M03 highway that runs from Kharkiv in the north all the way down to Bakhmut, which stretches out to Kyiv as well. So you can see Bakhmut is the highway junction between these two main supply routes. It's located where the T0504 intersects and connects with the M03 highway. These are the two literal biggest transportation arteries in the country when it comes to ground shipping, and it creates a kind of full circle around their entire front lines and runs from Poland through Kyiv. If Russia cuts that in half at Bakhmut, it hurts Ukraine's logistics and resupply ability. Exactly how much, I do not claim to know. But at the same time, capturing these roads don't really significantly increase Russia's ability to resupply their own forces because they don't run back through their territory. The M03 highway has already been cut off by Russian troops at the location closest to Bakhmut, but the last remaining highway out of Bakhmut, the T0504, is still open as of time of recording this video on March 15th. According to the military analyst Michael Kaufman, who visited Bakhmut with Rob Lee in early March, he had this to say: "From artillery ammo shortages, increasingly contested lines of communication, and an attritional battle in unfavorable terrain, this fight doesn't play to Ukraine's advantages as a force. There are a couple of questions this raises, like whether or not it's more important to hold on to territory or more important to destroy as much of the enemy forces as possible. Ukraine chose to sacrifice some manpower and equipment in order to hold on to Bakhmut past when conditions were favorable for them. But withdrawing and losing land can be a blow to your troops' morale, especially when it's your nation's territory that you're giving up. There are no easy answers in Bakhmut, it seems. One of Ukraine's generals surprised many analysts when he said that the location of the Ukrainian spring counteroffensive might actually take place in the area near Bakhmut. The Guardian's Dan Sabah suggested this was likely a misdirection, and Ukraine continues to probe the southern front lines for a weak link to possibly attack. The only possible thing I could think of as to why Bakhmut might be a good location for a counterattack with Western tanks is the fact that Russia has poured so much effort and resources into attacking here, going on the offensive, and they've spent very little time with defensive fortifications in this region according to satellite imagery. Extensive Russian efforts to harden defensive lines all around the southern part with trenches and concrete pillboxes, so Bakhmut might actually make a really interesting location for a spring counteroffensive. This map shows the paved roads and non-paved roads in and out of Bakhmut. It's an important distinction to look at because evacuating or bringing supplies in requires paved roads during the muddy season. While only the major T-0504 highway remains in Ukraine control, there's still one additional paved road leading out of the city as of March 15th. If Ukraine is forced to withdraw, they would need to have this road open if they don't want to get trapped there. If they did withdraw, they would be headed back north about 1 hour's drive away to the city of Kramatorsk, which has been building up their defensive positions for over 8 years and is even more heavily fortified and sits on top of easier, higher to defend terrain compared to Bakhmut. The distance of 40 kilometers places this city within Russian artillery if they're able to capture the city of Bakhmut. But the only difference now is that there's only one major highway to safely resupply Kramatorsk, the MO3. Ukrainian President Zelensky hasn't really tried to hide this fact. He said outright in an interview, "We understand that after Bakhmut they could go further. They could go to Kramatorsk. They could even go to Slovyansk. It would be an open road for Russians after Bakhmut to other towns in Ukraine in the Donetsk region." But a Russian assault in this direction would be just as costly and would require assaulting through wide open terrain from tree line to tree line once again. And how exactly did they successfully assault past wide open fields with no cover up to the urban center of Bakhmut in the first place? Russian forces made Bakhmut the location of their main offensive efforts starting in August 2022 when they began heavy artillery shelling. A Russian missile strike on September 22nd blew up the main bridge that crosses the Bakhmutka River, which disrupted Ukrainian military logistics and made the eastern half of the city more difficult to defend. By early November 2022, much of the combat around Bakhmut had turned into trench warfare similar to World War I. Ukrainian soldiers had built a network of trenches in front of the city. Trenches might seem antiquated, but in reality, even with all the modern advances in technology, breaking through a fortified defensive trench is incredibly difficult. You present a very small target when you're inside of a trench, and it's impossible to fire a small arm round through 6 feet of dirt. The biggest problem facing soldiers who are using trenches is it's difficult to get resupply to your trench line. You can't just drive up an armored vehicle and drop off supplies. They need to be carried by hand sometimes. The Russian assault tactics solution to defeat the trenches have been brutal and cost thousands of soldiers, but it has proven effective in some ways, and it's worth digging into this deeper. The solution they turned to were small assault units that would launch dozens of separate small probing attacks each day. Tatarigami UA on Twitter wrote a great breakdown on the Russian assault units and how they operate in Bakhmut. I suggest you take a look at it. These groups are called storm units and are often composed of 1 or 2 main battle tanks and 2 to 4 BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and 40 to 80 soldiers are attached to this storm unit. We know the Russian forces have changed their tactics from these large divisions and battalion tactical groups to smaller companies based on these captured documents. The first part of the documents cover urban warfare principles for how they're going to storm the Bakhmut city. This is exactly the kind of fighting Wagner forces are now entering as they attempt to capture the second half of Bakhmut's urban center. The paper states to ensure safe passage, holes should be made in walls and buildings by tanks or explosive charges on buildings. The assault company is advised to not move along roads and straight streets. They are also told to not place observation points on rooftops or buildings in urban environments. This is likely because Ukrainian snipers would easily pick them off, and your silhouette would make you stand out like a sore thumb on the top of a building. Snipers have become a major factor in the Battle of Bakhmut on both sides. We see here a Wagner mercenaries using an MTS 5.66 sniper rifle. According to Tatarigami UA's analysis of the documents, if the multi-store building is well fortified and can't be easily assaulted, then the squeezing method should be used. Instead of blocking the building, the Russian assaulters take cover in nearby buildings. Meanwhile, artillery pounds the target of the Ukrainian defenders. This forces the Ukrainians to leave the building, which gives the storm units a chance to advance forward. They often have temporary commanders attached to lead these units, only for a single mission, and the soldiers have varying skill levels between highly trained to brand new recruits in these assault units. Getting thrown into one of the storm units is sometimes used as a punishment in the Russian army to penalize disobedient soldiers. These small, decentralized units do have some advantages. They allow Russian soldiers to have flexibility to quickly attack Ukrainian defensive positions and trenches where they're able to identify a location that only had a few defenders and no anti-tank munitions left. They're able to exploit these weaknesses in the Ukrainian defenders' front lines. At this point, they bring up a tank to exploit the weakness with direct fire on the trench, and 2 infantry fighting vehicles usually hide in a tree line and lay down covering fire for 2 Russian storm squads to move up and advance through a kind of no man's land, which in Ukraine is often referred to as the gray zone. The main tactic used was to send in inexperienced soldiers or prisoners first in a kind of human wave tactic in order to get the Ukrainian defenders to reveal their position. Then, once the first wave of Russian recruits had exhausted the Ukrainian soldiers, they would throw a second wave of elite, well-trained and equipped Russian paratroopers to capture and hold the trench. Out of this came the shocking result that thousands of Wagner mercenaries were just left out in the field, where they were wounded during an assault. Ukrainian defenders are sometimes using old World War II era Maxim machine guns to defend their trench positions as well, showing how desperate both sides are. The nitty-gritty of trench warfare tactics aren't often talked about, but for defenders it requires more training than you might think, and more important than training, it requires discipline. If your entire squad defending a trench gets tunnel vision and sucked into combat, it creates a major problem for you. The natural tendency to want to pay attention and help out your buddies can allow the enemy to sneak into your flank and take out your entire squad. Avoiding tunnel vision is average infantryman 101. This is why every fire team having their own sector of fire is so important, and discipline to avoid that human nature, that instinct to direct your attention towards where the fighting is happening. It requires you watch your 30 to 40 degrees of field of view in front of you, or even if there is no contact there and contact is happening 100 meters down the line. In fact, a vast majority of average infantryman training is about muscle memory, of staying in your lane of fire, not getting distracted what's happening to your right and left. But it takes seasoned squad leaders and NCOs, your sergeants, to keep their fire team's attention on their sector of fire, even if nothing is happening in your sector for that time being. When we hear Russian and Ukrainian armed forces have lost a lot of their veteran, seasoned leadership and lower enlisted leaders, this is where the real problem is. No one with experience to control sectors of fire and create discipline during combat. The captured Russian field manual documents state the following about tree line assaults. During the tree line assault, the platoon should move in a diamond formation. During an assault, it's prohibited for an assault company or platoon to move through open spaces. They should instead move solely through the tree line. Tree line battles are a type of warfare that you often don't hear about, but it's one of the main types of combat in almost any war. On December 19th, Ukrainian forces used donated British Wolfhound tactical vehicles to counterattack and push Wagner forces back. And for a period of a few weeks, we see a constant back and forth like this, where Russia would advance and then Ukrainians would repel that attack and regain contested ground. But in early January 2023, Russian forces began making real progress with their storm unit tactics by capturing the city of Soledar 10 kilometers north of Bakhmut. This put increased pressure on Bakhmut and made resupply through Route M03 more difficult. It was this effort to encircle the city from the north and south that began to yield results for Russia. In response at the time, John Kirby, the US National Security Council, even if Bakhmut and Soledar fall to the Russians, it's not going to have a strategic impact on the war itself. It's at this point in late January that we know Russia began reinforcing Wagner units with better trained paratroopers, a move that would limit Prigozhin's influence and allow Putin to make further advances with his own regular soldiers. Prigozhin is of course the leader of the Wagner mercenaries. Stark Pafari created a detailed battlefield rundown on how the battle in Bakhmut is unfolding. The highlights to note are that the Ukrainian air defense was able to shoot down a Russian Su-24 strike fighter. The Russian pilot ejection was caught on camera. The press attached to Ukraine's 93rd Brigade caught footage of the soldier using an Igla to bring attack aircraft down. The Ukrainian Air Force is still operating here, successfully conducting 9 strikes in the region recently. This shows that air superiority is still hotly contested. Ukraine claims the attrition rate for this part of the battle in Bakhmut between August 2022 and mid-February 2023 was 7 Russian soldiers taken out for every 1 Ukrainian lost. The US Department of Defense places it slightly lower at 5-to-1 ratio. This supports the claim that Ukraine is choosing to stay and fight in Bakhmut because the attrition numbers are in their favor. Estimates place Russian casualties between 20 and 30,000 in Bakhmut. Michael Kaufman had this to say: "I think the tenuous defense of Bakhmut achieved a great deal, expending RU manpower and ammunition. But strategies can reach points of diminishing returns, and given UA is trying to husband resources for an offensive, it could impede the success of a more important operation." And this is where we need to talk about what a Pyrrhic victory means in military terms, because even if Russia does capture Bakhmut, it might be considered a Pyrrhic victory. The term is named after a famous Greek general named Pyrrhic from 280 BC, who defeated 2 Roman armies, and when he was congratulated by one of his buddies, he said this: "One more victory like that over the Romans, and we shall be completely undone." Because by that point, he had lost a large part of the army that he came with and almost all of his close friends and most of his trusted generals, who were irreplaceable. A Pyrrhic victory is now defined as a victory that is not worth winning because the winner has suffered or lost so much in winning it. So even if Russia does win in Bakhmut, it would be a backhanded compliment of a win. We do not know if this will turn out to be the case for Russian forces. They may go on to capture more territory after this, but the casualty numbers and the cost of capturing Bakhmut is staggering. As of March 15th, the latest news of the front lines indicate that the Wagner mercenary attacks are reaching a culmination. This is a military lingo way of saying they're exhausted and have no ability to continue forward. According to the Institute for the Study of War, their latest assessment says attacks have decreased from 100 ground attacks per day to now only 20. Some reports from the ground even indicate Ukrainian forces are pushing Russian units back. We won't know for sure how this is going to play out though. This could just be Russian forces are waiting for the flanks to encircle instead of pushing through the city straight away. Last time I covered Bakhmut, I talked about the influence Wagner mercenary leader Prigozhin was gaining in Bakhmut, and how critical he had become for the Russian military leadership in Moscow. They almost became too reliant and too dependent on him, I said, and I wondered how it would end up playing out, but I couldn't have imagined it going the way that it has. The ISW assessed the Russian Ministry of Defense was likely using the battle in Bakhmut to reduce the Wagner group and whittle away their strength because of the feud between the two. In fact, Prigozhin himself said on camera he believes that the Russian Ministry of Defense is not giving him enough ammo on purpose to destroy him. Likely paranoid thinking, but it's interesting to see what he thinks. However, by March of 2023, these favorable attrition ratio for Ukraine had likely become far worse, maybe even a match or worse than that. A Ukrainian medic said his battalion came in the middle of December between all the different platoons. There were 500 of them, and then a month later there were literally only 150 left. What's certain is that both sides are paying heavily in this battle. There's an important terrain feature in this region, the 88-kilometer long river called Bakhmutka, which is a tributary of the Donets River. This river splits the urban center of the city in half from east to west. It's a key terrain feature that works in the favor of defending forces. There are 2 key bridges that cross the river here and here. Roughly 70% of the city is built up with high-rise apartments and stores, while the rest is parks, fields, and gardens. On March 3rd, Ukrainian soldiers destroyed 2 of the key bridges in Bakhmut, separating the east and western part of the city and slowing down the Russian advance. This created the possibility for a controlled fighting withdrawal. But all this tactic will do is slow Russia down as they move to encircle the city instead. As of March 15th, one of the last remaining paved highways out of Bakhmut is still open, but Russian ground forces are closing in. And this is where the fog of war really thickens, because you might have noticed there are dozens of conflicting reports of what's really happening in Bakhmut, ranging from Zelensky is reinforcing the town and doubling down on its defense, to other reports indicating Ukraine is laying the groundwork for withdrawal. The Institute for the Study of War reported on March 3rd it looked like Ukrainian forces were prepping the battlefield for an orderly withdrawal from Bakhmut, but then we got whiplash because the very next day the evaluation had changed that the Russian forces were unlikely to surround the city at any time soon. Putting aside whether or not Bakhmut is strategically important for a second, the way Ukraine chooses to withdraw or not withdraw is very important, because if 20 to 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers are left inside the city, then thousands of troops becoming prisoners of war is not the same as them withdrawing and able to fight another day. That would be unacceptable and unnecessary loss for Ukraine. I suspect a few things could be happening here. Zelensky could be taking a strongman approach and trying to appear like they have no plan to withdraw, while at the same time sending reinforcements to help with the withdrawal from the city and slow down Russia's advance. Or the Ukrainian military leadership might have intelligence that leads them to believe they actually stand a chance of holding on to the city. We just don't know at this point. However, it's important to note we know how worried Russia is about Ukrainian counteroffensive. Analysis of satellite images since the last offensive in September, you can note that massive defensive fortifications and trench lines have since popped up and appeared all over southern Ukraine. This is visible by satellite imagery. Russia is putting their newly mobilized recruits to use and building trenches throughout the territory they've annexed. What happens here in Bakhmut is still fiercely debated, with each side claiming they will capture the city in the future. Whether it turns out to be a symbolic prize or a strategic turning point is yet to be seen.